Let's get started. So I'm Joanna Veronkovich, one of the co-faculty directors of the Center for Cultural Affairs. It's very nice to see everyone today. And we are really excited to have our speaker for our workshop in cultural affairs, Preston Keeney from the College of Charleston. Wonderful to have you, Kate. Kate is an associate professor and program director of arts management at the College of Charleston. And she conducts research in arts management, nonprofit management, with a specific focus on cultural policy. So we're really happy to have Kate with us. And I'm just going to hand it over to Kate and I will help moderate. And otherwise, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. This is such a great series, and I appreciate you inviting me to speak today on a paper that I've been playing around with for longer than I should have at this point. So this gave me an opportunity to kind of pick it back up again. And I'm really interested in seeing potentially conceptualizing or imagining a new permanent role, I think, for state arts agencies following the pandemic, or we're still amidst the pandemic. So I want to certainly acknowledge many of you in this room have done work in this area, including emergency management, work in state arts agencies, work in federalism in the arts. So I've really pulled from a lot of work of folks that I know are attending this workshop with regularity. And so state arts agencies really give us this opportunity to study federalism at work. And I've always I guess I'm a public administration scholar. I've always been interested in state arts agencies and the sort of mixed system of federal, state, local activity that allows for public art activity in the United States. So in this particular project, I'm using intergovernmental relations theory to advance this particular system in the implementation of emergency funding. Particularly, I look at the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan and other forms of artist relief focused on the pandemic. So I look at budgetary and programmatic responses in the American South, so the 9 states in the South Arts region. So this is not the only time that state arts agencies have responded to some sort of national or here a global crisis, but we are looking in the US context, but it's not often. So this particular moment, I think, gives us an opportunity to see state arts agencies perhaps in this expanded role, distributing artist relief, just the funding, programmatic initiatives that they took on. And I really thought about, this concept of the tools, the mechanisms that we saw implemented either as a one-time sort of adoption during the pandemic, or perhaps something that they will continue further. So my talk for today, again, this is certainly a work in progress. So I'll kind of build up this argument, I think, that I am imagining or see developing around emergency management in state arts agencies. So I'll talk a little bit about the context and my research goals here and where I'm positioning myself specifically. And then I think perhaps most important to where I am in my work is the literature that is supporting this idea, or the theoretical frames that are helping me to conceptualize state arts agencies in this way. Then I'll show the data that I've collected. It's not a lot of data, but I did a questionnaire to the states and just relied on existing information that we had about funding, for example. And then I'll sort of talk through next steps and certainly have a conversation. So that's my plan for today. So one of the things that I, again, just as a fan of studying state arts agencies, and this is not particularly related to COVID, but something that I think a lot about is just the role of state arts agencies. And so someone who wants them to exist, wants them to have a purpose. My colleague was here from South Arts giving a talk at the College of Charleston, and we were just, discussing this point that she also thinks about a lot, if the money dries up, what is the role for state arts agency? And we certainly see evidence of a lot of states where the money is not very much, or it's been threatened to dry up, especially in the South. So if we were not in the business of giving grants, would we have a purpose? And I think that's just generally a place that I am interested in investigating. We have this 1960s policy mechanism here. And, what are we if we're not just in the money in the business of passing through money? So, and I know that's been discussed before, but I think this moment of the pandemic and potentially seeing some other important role for state arts agencies is exciting to me. And I don't know that it's an intentional role, but I don't even know if it's real, but this is what I'm trying to uncover with this particular project. So I want to start first just with a little nod to the ecosystem that we're talking about here, and how this contributes to what's going on with the COVID pandemic. So the fact that the arts in general, the public arts community is very decentralized, and that's certainly the flavor of that, or the approach to that varies a little bit from state to state. But here in South Carolina, for example, we are tried and true, right? The arts is a decentralized activity here, and we're prioritizing states and localities and nonprofits and the private sector to make that happen. The arts ecosystem can be fragile. Yes, we certainly see appropriations, for example, mapping however the economy is doing, but there is a lot of other fragility depending on who's elected. Gallagher did a report, did a paper around emergency management and natural disasters, and really talked about the vulnerability of small startup nonprofit arts organizations and how they are so vulnerable to closing. Her finding was, that they cease to exist after a natural disaster. And this is particularly problematic because often those small or are starting nonprofit organizations are serving populations that are not being served otherwise. We also have a lot of evidence about how important the arts sector is to other sectors. And I think that this was particularly pronounced during the pandemic as well. And that if we're going to collapse and the arts are forced to close their doors, what kind of effect this has on other businesses and communities. Certainly, it would stall a lot of activity here in Charleston, for example. So the sustainability of arts organizations, even from that perspective, is very important if we are so integrated into these other facets of the community, which I think all in this room would agree that we are. As I mentioned before, this is not the first time that state arts agencies have been in the business of helping to give out to social stimulus. We saw this with the Great Recession, certainly, and the state arts agency has always been a landing place for federal money. So this is not the first time, and we can also kind of talk about, we have different definition of a disaster or an emergency, and for the purposes of this work, I've kind of mixed them all together here. But this could include times of natural or man-made disaster, and including something like the pandemic. So Rodelli says cultural policy is not solely about funding and requesting money, but includes framing the debate about arts and culture and its role in the community. So again, this idea, it's not just about grant giving, but that the arts as an ecosystem and state arts agencies as a healthy part of that ecosystem are really important moving forward. I'll mention here too, just on the social stimulus grant part, we're talking about what I focus on in this project is the $75 million that the NEA distributed through the CARES Act. 30 million went directly to state arts agencies, and then also $135 million that the NEA distributed through the American Rescue Plan. So those are the two kind of pockets that I'm looking at, and there are other sources of funding and revenue that materialized during this time as well. So in this context, again, I'm really interested to conceptualize an emerging role here, an emerging role for state arts agencies that aligns somehow with emergency management. And is this something that's going to stick, right? So part of the things that came up in the questionnaire is that this has happened this fiscal year. This happened we allowed at one time, or other findings from the questionnaire were this is something that has been long overdue and we want to continue with this, and this is what we've learned, and this is how we can continue to serve nonprofits moving forward. So again, I really wanted to position this in this framework of intergovernmental relations theory, just because the state arts agency is such a classic example of that. I wanted to just kind of know what were the policies and programs, what were the tools that were utilized in addition to funding during this time, and also to establish a basis of research moving forward. So again, at the earlier stages of this project. So I'll begin here with this sort of next section of my talk, moving through the theoretical frames that support this conceptualization of the state arts agencies fulfilling this role. Like, is this something that makes sense? Is this something that they could do? So I'll talk a little bit just about state arts agencies, intergovernmental relations theory, emergency management, which also is positioned well in IGR, and also policy diffusion. At least in my area of the country, I don't know that state arts agencies are the most innovative organizations here. So we're kind of looking and borrowing from one another and the tools that we are using. So again, I think that that's a piece of this as well in terms of what we are adopting and what might stick moving forward. So just talking a little bit again, in this context of the state arts agency, as this is really the unit of analysis of this work. And I think we can think about the state in comparison to the federal level, the NEA, right? What are the pros and cons of this sort of activity happening at the state level versus maybe what the NEA can offer? And so importantly, I think when we look at the subnational level, we can see what utility the state arts agency has, what closer connections they have to the nonprofit organizations or the artists, and really that we rely on this mixed system even more and more as problems become more complex. And so state arts agencies are particularly positioned to help maybe regionally concentrated or racial or ethnically concentrated organizations, better so than maybe another upper level administration or grant giver. We see these sorts of relationships particularly important at the subnational level. And so we need both this mixture of a central and devolved relationship in order to fulfill the roles of the state and the arts ecosystem. So I mentioned emergency management fits well into intergovernmental relations theory. So do state arts agencies, right? I'm just talking about this mixed system. And again, as we are experiencing, at least we know, more natural disasters and maybe the likelihood for more man-made crises or disasters, we rely on this system in order to overcome challenges, right? That we have an interdependence on one another, and that we need all levels of government to come up with the solutions and serve organizations as problems become more complex. Traditionally, we've used grants and aid as a tool to do this. So I'm trying to understand, right, who is really having the authority here amidst something like the pandemic? Is it the NEA who is more influential or having authority? Is it the state? And how might we see that sticking over time? Rodelli did a piece on creative placemaking and the NEA, and talking about the tools that the NEA used to advance creative placemaking. And in that finding, it was really it was the federal level here that's leading the charge, right? That's helping to instill value or framework around creative placemaking. And so I think that's yet to be understood here in the realm of emergency management. So again, emergency management really positions itself well in this lens. And we require the shared knowledge and functions across our stratified government in order to address emergencies. There's some literature now connecting the arts and emergency management. I mentioned Gallagher before, but certainly we're going to have to be working increasingly together to confront the complex challenges moving forward. And then I also mentioned policy diffusion. This idea that the tools that we're going to adopt, if they're one time or a permanent adoption of something post-pandemic, that state arts agencies, and here we're talking about local arts agencies, see each other as a reference group. What are you doing? How can I borrow that idea moving forward? And certainly knowing, there might be some things that are more adopted more easily when it's influenced by the federal government or when I'm influenced by a peer state, sort of a peer-to-peer relationship. So I'm including this lens as well as I look at the sort of tools or programs that might stick moving forward. So a couple of working propositions that I want to bring up, and I think, again, we see this particularly in the subnational arts ecosystem or arts policy network here. So the first is that the complexities of addressing natural or man-made disasters, again, for the purposes of this research, I'm lumping them all together, require multi-levered governance approaches. And then this is including in the arts context. So we certainly have a lot of literature about this in other fields, particularly emergency management, but how can we maybe explore this more as a value or contribution in the arts? Secondly, because of its reliance on third parties, states and localities have increased authority in the area of aid and relief to the arts. So I think this is the one where I'm toying around, and I mentioned previously with the NEA and creative placemaking, what level here is really carrying the flag or having the authority or importance maybe in aid, right? So a lot of money came from the federal level, but what else is the state arts agency doing? Again, trying to position them and having potentially a new role moving forward. And third here, state arts agencies will adopt policy tools that were necessitated during the pandemic. So is it a one-time outcome or change, or will we see activities stick, things that they might carry forward? And I think, at least from this questionnaire that I've distributed, I have mixed evidence on that as well. So I looked at a couple pieces of data, both through what was existing. Most of the existing information was related to funding. And I used a lot of information from the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and they helped me to sort of navigate also what was coming from the NEA. And this is certainly a moving target too. I mean, there's continuous efforts to add to emergency relief or aid continuing on with the pandemic. So I looked at certainly funding. I also looked at organizational mission statements. I looked at programmatic changes, things that might be either one time or ongoing. And I also was interested in how grant requirements might have changed specifically, again, either one time or ongoing. This is a preliminary, again, I distributed a questionnaire. This is preliminary data, and certainly I'm not yet to a point with at least what I've gathered so far that allows me to address all the propositions I'm hoping to uncover, but I think this data gives a highlight at least of what could be emerging. So again, I looked at the South Arts region. These are the 9 states in my region. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. And I looked at this just as a subset of the population. And I think certainly if I looked at the funding and asked the same questions in a separate region, it could be very different, just knowing how different states value the arts differently. But I just looked at here as a starting place, and because I'm here and have access to the data as well, I did a preliminary, developed a questionnaire with my closest contact in South Carolina, the South Carolina Arts Commission, developed a questionnaire with him. And then I distributed it to the 9 states. I still am missing one. So, we're working on that. Developed a questionnaire and implemented that and collected data mostly over the summer, and still trying to follow up on some things. Part of the questionnaire was just confirming information that I was finding through the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies or the NEA as things were kind of moving. So a lot of the information that they had, they would let me know, we found this at one point. We need to double check and confirm that this is still true, and this is sort of a moving target. So here's again the population for this particular study. So one of the things I wanted to look at first was just mission statements, because of this idea, right, that we are not usually in the business of emergency management. We have before passed money from the federal government following an economic crisis, for example. But do state arts agencies see themselves in this role, or do we see this in an intentional way? Or is it something that maybe could be adopted more formally moving forward? So I just did, kind of a simple deductive analysis here of the mission statements of these 9 states. And across the top here, you see kind of the most common threads in the mission statement: the economy, quality of life, vibrant community, promoting value and benefit from the arts, right? Making sure people benefit from the arts. Only one state mentioned artistic excellence. Access, a lot of terminology around the arts for all. Only one state mentioned the word access. This idea that we are stimulating the arts, right? We're growing, we're a catalyst either for arts or arts participation. Certainly providing support, and that could be different types of support, including financial. And one state meant that being fair and transparent was important to their mission, but that was only one state as well. These similar themes across the mission statement was also found by Foreman and Warnett in 2020, and they looked at national arts councils across countries. There were some additional themes like diplomacy, but again, there is nothing explicit about emergency aid or relief as part of a mission statement. So again, just one way to account for the fact that yes, this is a 1960s policy mechanism that is now more regularly included in this way or in this work, and how might we think about that in a little bit more with more intentionality. Just a couple of examples from the mission statements that I wanted to bring out. The first one from the Georgia Council for the Arts really shows kind of this instrumental application, right? We're growing the state of Georgia through the arts. It's less focused on propelling the arts or artistic excellence, but we're using the arts towards another end. I thought the Kentucky Arts Council was interesting because it could mean so many things. That the Kentucky Arts Council is fostering environments for the people of Kentucky in order to value, participate, benefit from the arts. So I thought that was an interesting and very broad category, and what that could mean. Again, thinking of what is the role or what is the duty of the Arts Council. And the last one, I mentioned this in the last slide, but there was only one state that mentioned equitable access in the mission statement, which I thought was interesting. There were a couple of statements of arts for all, which is maybe another way of saying it, but equitable access being explicit was only in one state. So the next 2 slides, and I think the second slide is the better viewing where I've charted this, is where I'm trying to show here again the stimulus money from 2020, 2021 from South Arts, and also supplemental funds. And I put that alongside the FY20 appropriation. And I chose the FY20 appropriation because that was before things started getting a little bit strange. So here I have the FY20 appropriation without line items. And I kind of wanted to just see, and again, the next slide I think highlights it better. I just wanted to see like, what are we talking about here? Like, what's the contribution of this emergency relief compared to, you know, what the regular appropriation is, and then the supplemental appropriation, the supplemental funding is an odd animal because several of those might be multi-year, for example. But again, I'm putting this all together for this sort of illumination of how we could see states really being instrumental in this mixed system in providing emergency aid. Now, certainly a lot of this money did not come from the state, but I think what's most important in this chart here is to look, I hope you can tell, I shouldn't have used two shades of blue, but the lighter color blue is the supplemental fund. So we've got the darker blue is the appropriation. The CARES money and the ARP money that came from the NEA is not particularly significant. We're talking $600,000, significant for some states, but compared to the supplemental, the South Arts money was quite small as well. That also came from the NEA, but the supplemental funds could have included, for example, what the state gave in addition to the NEA pocket of CARES or ARP money. It could have just been supplemental general state money, and it could have been multi-year. Something that I would like to investigate moving forward after just, again, seeing the significance of these contributions at the state level is perhaps drilling down on one state. I'd say like Tennessee is a good example. And they're, again, a little bit, this is not telling a totally accurate picture because the supplemental money could be multi-year, but they did a lot during the pandemic. They did a lot. The state, in addition to the federal allocations from the NEA, prioritized the arts during this time, and they did a lot of programmatic activity to support artist relief as well. So the other second part that I looked at here were several qualitative questions to the 9 states. And I really wanted to find out again about grant processes or grant categories that may be changed either one time or moving forward, and also just general program operations. And I've put on here, most of the ones on this list are permanent. If it says one time, that's because they said, you know, we only did this for FY21 or FY22. We plan to go back. But certainly prioritizing just general administrative and general operations grants, flexibility, allowing for funding for capacity building where they didn't before, or something like strategic planning. A lot of several states in this population decreased the matching requirement, and that's something that they plan to continue with. There was a one-time change where they took some money away from organization grants and gave them to artists specifically. And then we also see new categories of grants that, at least from my conversation that I've had with them so far, they plan to continue. Some states have said, we don't know what this is going to look like. We don't know what's going to stick and what we're going to carry forward. But certainly having maybe something that's a more evergreen, resilient sort of grant category would make sense. In Tennessee, they describe the Arts Resilience Grant category as helping organizations to build a track record of federal grants administration, which I thought was interesting. That could certainly be an evergreen activity. So these are some of the changes in the grant guidelines. Also from Tennessee, I mentioned that this state seemed particularly helpful in the pandemic. The resilience grant, the purpose of the grant was to engage the creative sector in ways that strengthen communities during the pandemic, increase community and organizational resiliency, create a sense of belonging and place, advance public health efforts, enlist and employ artists and creative workers, and stimulate economic recovery. Again, that is language that I could certainly see being carried forward and connects to so much, could be emergency specific, could be in a non-emergency. Again, thinking about the role of the state arts agency beyond just implementing grants. The second sort of qualitative question that I probed was around general programs and operations. And kind of to sum this up, there's a lot of, hybridity, digital, transitioning to digital platforms for things as simple as workflow for reviewing a panel review, for example, more open office hours, virtual office hours for people who had questions. The fourth point on here, the peer-to-peer networks, several states said that that's something that they started during the pandemic and plan to continue. One included bi-weekly communications with the urban arts councils in their state. So starting that up is something that came out of the pandemic as well. Certainly guidance on how to reopen. Several states said that they established sort of a clearinghouse of information. And then several states also adopted remote work practices and policies that will stick as well. The second slide I thought was particularly interesting. This comes from Alabama. All of this slide comes from Alabama. And they told me in the questionnaire that everything in the grant processes was significantly changed because of the pandemic. In their description, it was that this has been long overdue, but this is something that we want to carry forward. And interestingly, they talked about staff changes that were needed and novel approaches to implementing the work of the state arts agency, and that the pandemic and the staff changes because of the pandemic kind of allowed that to happen. So that they needed some new ideas, new processes, improvements. This time allowed them for that to happen, and they see that moving forward. So what's next, right? Where does this leave me? I want to return again, and I'll kind of end on this next slide. I want to return again to the working propositions, because again, in this limited data I've collected through the questionnaire, I just have a preliminary understanding, or maybe a highlight of the role the states played during this time. I haven't, for example, detailed all recovery efforts, as those are ongoing. I haven't looked at cross-sectoral initiatives, which I know a lot of states implemented as well. I have not talked to the nonprofits or the artists who were the recipients of this relationship or the aid coming from the state. So there's a lot still to do. And I think, I'm still kind of debating with my own, with the knowledge I've collected so far, this question of like authority and who is the significant player in this relief effort? Is it just the money coming from the federal level, or is it also that paired with the supplemental guidance and funding from the state, ideas and programs coming from the state as well, and those important relationships and the ability to help maybe the more vulnerable communities or organizations or artists in that area, that gives that maybe some more importance in the relationship. So that's sort of where I am, and I will end my remarks at this point, and happy to have some discussion around this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And I did want to address just one comment that came up in the comment box about whether or not, it's Jeannie's comment, a question, is this state appropriations or state federal combo? So in the chart, everything was federal. The supplemental category included state designated ARPA or CARES money, and only one state had
state money given to this. So sometimes they said, you know what, it didn't come from the NEA. It was additional ARPA CARES money that the state designated towards the arts. Only one state actually gave their own general money towards the effort. I think that answers the question. Oh. Just state appropriations, FY20. Yeah, sorry, thanks.
Okay, great. Great. So actually, I see we have a lot of, and I don't mean to call people out, but it's kind of exciting to see that we have a lot of state agency representatives on the call today. And I guess I wanted to give maybe first priority to any of our participants on the call who do work in the state arts agency environment for just first dibs on questions or comments. Sometimes we kind of get in the weed with the research and the methods, and I want to sort of maybe make this a little bit more practical if we can. So if anybody has a comment or question, and again, not to call people out, and I won't name names. Okay, it's fine if not.
Hey,
Maya.
Hey, Joanna, it's Maya. I'll jump in on behalf of Indiana. So yeah, thanks. This was a great presentation, Kate. We really appreciate doing the work. You doing the work. So I'm curious about your sort of thoughts and comments around the idea of crisis intervention and what that, how. I mean, obviously, we know the pandemic, obviously, that was a crisis, right? So I'm wondering if you're thinking about crisis response related to state level crises as well. In other words, have you sort of thought about, I mean, obviously, the pandemic was an international crisis, but I'm wondering if you've thought about.
I didn't position it in this way in terms of the data in the context of what I was looking at, but I think that's exactly what the state should be doing, I think, right? Is it a state crisis? Is it a community crisis that the state arts agency can help respond to and again, be an important convener in that? So I think I'd have to look at an example of one, but I could certainly, I certainly think that the conceptualization of this would translate to a state crisis, certainly. Is that kind of what you're going with?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could ask a follow-up, and then I promise I will stop talking. I think certainly, and some of us who are on here who are state arts agency leaders have just about a month or so come together at the NASA conference, and there's a lot of conversation around how our roles are changing as state arts agencies, and our work is changing. So this is really timely, which I think is one reason why you have a lot of state agency reps on this on the Zoom today. But I think we're seeing here in Indiana a growing recognition that, speaking to your comment earlier about quality of place, that part of why we saw some states respond so significantly with putting additional dollars toward their state arts agency budgets was the recognition that it wasn't just the sector that was in difficulty, but that the sector's difficulties impacted their communities and state more broadly. In other words, the quality of place impacts were really significant. And from our perspective here in Indiana, we're seeing that from communities that are coming to us now, sort of post-pandemic, recognizing that that's an area that the state needs to invest in more broadly. And the pandemic, in a way, has elucidated that. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you've sort of thought about.
Yeah, I would love to, I could totally imagine this at the state level. And like I said, I was interested, particularly, I mentioned in examining more deeply Tennessee, right? And seeing a state that potentially, and again, I just did a questionnaire, but is potentially seeing this as so valuable and integrated that we do need to do a lot here. There are a lot of tools, not just funding, but other tools and programs that need to be implemented for the state because of the integrated nature of the arts. So I think certainly too, I could develop that importance as well, and without even looking, at particular federal funding data and that sort of thing, but that interconnectedness as one of the reasons to get in more in the game here of crisis and emergency aid. Thank you for that comment.
Great. Just a question came up in the chat too, from Pam. Many state arts agencies made their regular state-driven grants more flexible to help arts organizations respond to the pandemic. And was your research able to speak to this?
Yeah. So one of the comments when in the qualitative open-ended question on the questionnaire about grant procedures or processes, flexibility came up. Flexibility, extra time, something as great as even if someone said they were going to do a program and they completely did another program, that was allowable. I do see varying on that sort of thing, particularly, or like the extra time or the flexibility. That's the sort of thing where in the responses, people said, this was for FY22 only. So it'd be interesting to find out why, or is that something that was so beneficial? Could it be always beneficial? And maybe why or why not allowing something like that moving forward, as we kind of also know about the difficulties people have in organizations and artists in applying for grants and reporting on grants and that sort of thing as well. So yes, definitely flexibility came up in the questionnaire. I see another question in the chat, or sorry, I'll let you, Joanna.
Oh, it's okay. I saw Amy had her hand up first, so I'll just address Amy's question first.
Kate, thank you so much for the really interesting work. I'm in New York, but I'm actually Southern originally, and I've been in Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina in the last month or so. And I've been thinking a lot in general about Southern politics at the moment and the difference between the state and local governments, and the fact that some of these states have these kind of important city clusters, whether that's music in Nashville or the sort of like Democratic concentration in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, or like Birmingham has a mayor everyone loves, Mayor Woodfin, and then the governor. I have heard some stories I will not repeat in this context, and I don't mean that in a partisan way. And I'm just wondering, I know you're doing kind of questionnaire data and it's at a state agency level, but especially looking at the more outsized numbers in some states, North Carolina, Tennessee, a little bit Alabama. I'm just wondering if you noticed anything even informally in this kind of city cluster versus state response, or if you could highlight some of that.
Well, I didn't look at cities in this project. But I guess I'm reminded of the previous commenter, Maya, about potentially cities that maybe recognize or value the integration concept. And that if we see that or we value that, we might be more willing to put forward some of the efforts or tools that I saw come across. One of the programmatic changes, when I was talking about the peer groups, one of the states said, right, that we now are meeting bi-weekly with the 4 largest urban arts councils. And I think that could speak to kind of what you're going with here too. And I think there's maybe pros and cons to that, right? We've got, this is true in South Carolina as well. Charleston looks very different from the rest of the state. So in South Carolina, they intentionally don't want to talk. They get enough of us, right? So who else are we talking to, right? If we just kind of, but I see also then those pockets that do have a lot of culture, and I think that's what you're describing here, Amy, or activity, as ones that can really make the case then for the connectivity and why this might be particularly important to carry the flag during a time of crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to say, this may be outside the scope of your project, or it may be for a future project. I'd just be really curious if there are different distributions of state like city and rural funding in the Southeast as opposed to other parts of the country, because I think there may be some particularities to the political environment and the kind of farm.
Yeah.
I've also been in rural Arkansas in the last week, I realized. But just to say, this is really, really interesting, and thank you so much for the work.
Thanks, Amy.
And then Yusuf had a question in the chat. So what are the criteria in changing the grants guidelines, collecting data, priorities which match SDGs?
So I think, Yusuf, your what I'm understanding your question is when the state agency said that they changed some criteria, they allowed more flexibility, for example. I didn't look at their grants. This was an open-ended question. So they gave examples like more time or less matching. One person said we decreased the match. One person said we changed the match from 100% requirement to 50% requirement. Collecting data. Nobody talked about reporting. I didn't get anyone who talked about, maybe that they eliminated the reporting or accountability necessary, but I could assume in this comment about flexibility that could be something that you could allow someone to be more flexible on, or maybe give them more time. And again, this is a little bit gray still, because they've also, I would follow up and say, is this something that you intend to stick with? And they would say, we don't know. We let it happen for this year. We're kind of still discussing what we've learned, what we might want to carry forward. So I don't know if I have the granular level there to fully answer the criteria. I didn't look at the grants.
Thanks, Kate. And I think Michael Rushton has his hand up.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joanna, and thank you, Kate. I really enjoyed this. I've had a long interest in state arts agencies and what they're all about, and so it was really interesting to see this talk. I'm going to take a step back from what some of the other questions were and go up to, as I like to, 30,000 feet and ask a slightly different question. At the beginning of your talk, you raised some big picture questions. Two of them were Eleonora's statement that, cultural policy is really about framing, framing the place of art and culture in society and these difficult kinds of questions. And then you also posed the question, are state arts agencies about anything other than just giving grants? And of course, during a pandemic or an emergency, you can say, well, we'll change the way we do grants according to circumstance, but otherwise, we're still essentially in the grant giving business. And I guess I wanted to ask, how do you, after all this research, how do you come back and answer those questions? Because as a devil's advocate might say, state arts agencies aren't involved in cultural policy at all, right? One thing they really don't want to do is to engage in a discussion really trying to frame the place of arts in society. Instead, it's a much safer, much less controversial tactic of simply giving grants and listing, even in their mission statements. Of course, all mission statements are bland. I'm throwing stones from a glass house here. Universities are as bad as anybody in terms of bland mission statements, but they're all in terms of sort of instrumental values and communities and economic benefits. Louisiana was the one state that had anything controversial in its statement, saying they care about artistic excellence. And even that is starting to come under fire in some context, saying, no, you can't say that. So how do you answer this question about, are they actually doing cultural policy, or is this really just about grants and maybe shifting grants? Because that I couldn't really see where that was going. And so I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think that's with the data I collected, and looking at funding, for example, that doesn't give me the answer, right? That's still showing here's a state distributing a lot of federal money. So, and that could happen, that's going to happen again, potentially, right? We're going to see federal money land here again. But those are always going to be a one-time thing. So I think your comment about, being safe, I don't know. I mean, I hear both sides of my own state about that. We had a conversation the other day where we literally said, well, they're not going to like us either way. They're going to think that, that we're not important either way. So let's push what we want, what we think is important. But, I certainly understand the hesitation too of playing it safe, or your comment about even saying something like artistic excellence is too crazy here. So no, I don't think that this particularly tells us, again, I think this gets to one proposition about authority, because in this picture of following federal money, you could say, well, I still see the authority in the federal level. That's where all this money came from, even the supplemental funds. That was usually ARPA and CARES money. But I think it'll take additional data, or maybe going into a particular state as a case to say, flesh out more of this idea as, this crux to a larger domino effect. And if that is to be true and valued, that we could make the case then that we could have a role in crises or emergency response or aid. And then who else would do it, I guess, right? Who else is going to do that for the art sector? That could be another discussion item. But so yeah, those are my 30,000. But I agree that what I've collected so far doesn't quite answer what I've set out or what I'm probing. Yep.
Carlos.
Hello, Katie. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Carlos. I'm a PhD student at SUNY Albany, and a researcher in cultural policy in Brazil. We are doing kind of similar research in state agencies, in capital agencies in Brazil regarding COVID response. And one of the questions you're trying to figure out, that's what I want to ask you, if you did try to put your finger in the same things, that how did the leadership agency frame the problem was? In other words, towards what end the grants were for? Was just to keep money into the agents' pocket so they don't migrate to other sectors? Was it to create new content, since arts and culture was something people went to during the pandemic? Was it to address capacity weaknesses so we could bounce back better? How did they frame the time horizon? In a first order, people think the problem was clear, but it could be different meanings to different people. So my question is, did you try to put your finger on how people differently frame the pandemic problem in the agencies? Yeah,
it would be interesting to maybe categorize the states, even though I only have 9 of them, into different pockets by framing. And the ones that, one of the programmatic changes that I forget which state, I think North Carolina, responded with is that they started doing research and contributing to information about economic development impact, so that they could use that moving forward. And that, something like that is very different than just saying, well, our job is to give money and make sure people's doors are opened. So I do think there was a range. Other states just said, this is the money we got. We didn't really do anything else. Thanks for your survey. So I think it could be interesting to group them, or if you looked at different states, group the value here, or where they feel they see themselves integrated into a larger network of importance. and identify as something other than grant giving. Because I agree that could really depend on who's in charge of that agency, especially if it was a, you know, political appointee, you might have a different flavor, and you could maybe categorize in that way. Yeah, good question.
So a couple of interesting comments in the comment box too, I wanted to pay attention to. So Dave's comment just on applying an applicant centric model. So change is viewed through the lens of benefiting the applicant's experience versus the agency's ease of administration. But then Pam has a very, she has a point about the idea I think that Michael was pushing, which is the question about how much do SAAs drive cultural policy. And she obviously lists a number of different ways in which SAAs might drive cultural policy through programs, for example, like creative and cultural districts, public arts and correctional programs. But this is a really good question. Sort of, you know, is it, we generally look at SAAs as like their function being to distribute appropriations, right? But then but related to that function is obviously a lot of implications of sort of how those funds ultimately get distributed, who receives them, and then those are ultimately driving consumption and production in the creative sectors in those particular states. So you know, you can sort of look at this, in my view, as kind of levels of how cultural policy are formed. It starts with the money, but obviously the money then has implications in these broader contexts. So I'm wondering if you might want to respond to Pam's comment or anything related to this idea again about how SAAs might be driving cultural policy.
Yeah, and I looking at that list, right, in the last two comments, I think we could also say, do they have the latitude to do that? Do they have the support to do that, or do they not? Are they a, you know, two-person organization with a very small budget? Then you might not be able to do those sorts of programs. And if you've got a greater capacity and support by the state, then perhaps you can. And so that could also be a response around the emergency management, disaster management. Do we have it? Can we even play in this space just on a capacity sort of angle moving forward? But I mean, I think this list is how I see state arts agencies, but I'm embedded in it, you know. And I think to Michael's point, a lot of people don't see them that way, or don't want them to exist at all, right? But I would say I would agree with Pam's comment that there is a lot of policy making, and that makes me go back to my point about, well, who else is going to do those things, right? We've got this perfectly positioned organization. People have tried to eliminate before, but that doesn't seem to be working. So if we've got this list of things that we want to see happening, who else is really positioned to do that? And I think in our mixed system, the answer is the state, unless you have some other coalition of large municipalities or something like that. I wouldn't see many localities, at least not the ones in my state, being able to do this work on their own.
And this actually gets back to the first question, which was just a clarification question, which it was Jeannie's question, is this state appropriations or state fed combo? And I mean, you know, this gets back to it, I think, because ultimately, again, the distribution of those appropriations are then influencing the state level budgets too, and the ultimate decisions of the legislature. And so this then gets incorporated in policy much more than we would arguably think. So an interesting sort of array of factors affecting all of the different decisions that are made, for sure. But we've come to time, but this has been a really wonderful conversation, and I'm so happy that we had a good representation from our state arts agencies here. So it was a testament, I think, for what we are trying to achieve with this workshop series, and that we're really trying to bridge between academia and practice. And so thank you all for being here. It was really nice to see everybody. Thank you especially to Kate It was really a pleasure having you and hearing about your work, and a nice opportunity for us to actually first meet.
All right. Thanks,
yeah.
everyone.
Thank you. And please come join us. We're taking a little break from the series over the holiday season. We're not coming back until after the new year. So do come back and join us in 2023. And in the meantime, happy Thanksgiving, everyone, and happy holidays. And I look forward to seeing you later on.
Bye.
Bye.